This is James Dean. Before the world turned him into a symbol, before the red jacket became an icon, before 3 films carved his name into eternity, he was just a young man standing outside a church watching the woman he loved marry someone else. On that day, he didn't speak, didn't shout, didn't make a scene. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes lowered, cigarette trembling between his fingers, as if the universe had quietly confirmed what he had always feared, that love, stability, and belonging were gifts reserved for other people. And that moment, as devastating as it was, didn't break him. It revealed him. To understand James Dean, you have to go back to the beginning, to a little boy who lost his mother at 9 years old and never recovered from it. She had been his shelter, the only person who understood his strange mix of gentleness and intensity. When she died, his world collapsed. His father sent him away to Indiana, and although his relatives loved him dearly, nothing could replace the sense of abandonment that settled into his bones. He carried it quietly, the way children do when they have no words for grief. As he grew older, the loneliness became a kind of fuel. He poured it into acting, into racing, into every reckless pursuit that made him feel alive for a few seconds at a time. Beneath the rebellious swagger the world adored, there was a wounded heart searching desperately for meaning, connection, and a place that finally felt like home. James Dean didn't just play broken characters. He lived them. And that vulnerability, raw, unfiltered, and tragically real, is what made him unforgettable. Before James Dean became the face of youthful rebellion, he was a small boy wandering barefoot across the quiet fields of Fairmont, Indiana, carrying a grief far too heavy for a child of 9. His story does not begin in the glare of Hollywood lights, but in the pale, sterile brightness of a hospital room where his mother, Mildred, took her final breath. She had been the center of his world, the one person who saw every corner of him, the sensitivity, the restlessness, the imagination that seemed to swirl behind his eyes. When she died, something inside him shattered so quietly that the adults around him didn't notice, but it was the kind of break that never fully heals. His father, overwhelmed and emotionally distant, sent him to live with his aunt and uncle on their farm. They loved him, yet the truth is simple and painful. Love that comes after abandonment cannot feel the same. Dean never said it aloud, but the separation from his father left a wound that shaped every relationship he would ever have. Even as a teenager, he carried himself like someone bracing for the next loss, the next goodbye, the next moment the world proved it could take something from him without warning. Life on the farm gave him structure, chores, routines, and the rhythm of small-town life. But it also gave him long stretches of silence, hours spent alone in barns, fields, and old wooden sheds where his thoughts became louder than anything around him. That solitude nourished his creativity. He sketched, he sculpted, he mimicked characters he saw in movies, and he began to understand that art could be a hiding place, a refuge where he could express feelings he didn't dare say out loud. The adults saw a quiet boy. His teacher, Adeline Null, saw something much more. A storm enclosed inside a gentle frame, a talent that felt too big for Fairmount. She encouraged him to join the school theater program, and on stage, something strange and powerful happened. For the first time since his mother's death, Dean felt alive in a way that didn't scare him. Acting was not an escape, it was a language. It let him pour his confusion, longing, and unspoken fears into characters who could say the things he couldn't. Every performance became a small exorcism of the loneliness he carried. It was clear even then that he wasn't performing to impress. He was performing to survive. Although he excelled in sports, basketball, track, baseball, none of it filled the hollow space inside him. The applause from school plays, the praise from his teacher, and the thrill of stepping into another person's skin began to pull him toward a future far beyond Indiana. But that future required something he had always struggled with: leaving. Leaving safety, leaving routine, leaving the only place where he had ever felt partly understood. By the time he finished high school, Dean had grown into a young man who seemed both distant and magnetic, the kind of person people were drawn to without fully understanding why. There was a quiet intensity in the way he spoke, a tenderness in the way he listened, and a hidden sadness behind every half-smile. He didn't fit neatly into small-town life. He was a spark looking for fuel. He was a story waiting for its conflict. And deep down, he knew Fairmount could no longer contain him. His wounds had shaped him, but his dreams were starting to demand more space. That was the moment James Dean understood something fundamental. To become who he was meant to be, he would have to leave behind the only world that had ever felt like home. Leaving Fairmount should have felt like a triumph for James Dean, a young man stepping into the wider world with talent burning under his skin. Instead, when he arrived in California to live with his father, he found himself facing a new kind of loneliness, one that came not from loss, but from distance. Winton Dean had started a new life, a more rigid, structured world that didn't make room for a sensitive, unpredictable son chasing a dream he barely understood himself. The two shared a roof, but not a relationship. Conversations were short, awkward, and heavy with everything unsaid. For a boy who had already lost one parent, the emotional absence of the other felt like a second abandonment. He enrolled at Santa Monica College, then transferred to UCLA to study drama. Classes offered him moments of escape, but the restlessness inside him refused to be contained by school walls. He wasn't meant for lecture halls, exams, or the predictable path his father hoped he would follow. Dean was electric, impulsive, driven by instincts he couldn't turn off. When he walked away from UCLA after just one semester, it wasn't rebellion, it was inevitability. His father didn't understand, and maybe Dean didn't either, but he knew this much. If he stayed in classrooms, the part of him that was alive would slowly suffocate. Hollywood was his next stop, but Hollywood didn't welcome him with open arms. At first, he took whatever he could get: commercials, background roles, blink and you'll miss him appearances on live television. Casting directors couldn't decide what to do with him. He was too intense, too strange, too hard to mold into the neat leading man stereotype studios loved. He didn't smile on command, he didn't follow instructions blindly. He didn't hide his emotions well, and when he did, it seemed to cost him something. For Hollywood, that made him a problem. For art, it made him a revelation, but only after someone was willing to see it. That someone wasn't in California. It was in New York. Driven by frustration and a nagging sense that he was suffocating again, Dean packed up and boarded a bus to Manhattan with barely enough money to survive. The city hit him like a wave, loud, messy, alive in a way he had never been. For the first time, he wasn't the strangest person in the room. He was simply another outsider among thousands. New York didn't mind intensity. New York thrived on it. And when he auditioned for the Actors Studio, Lee Strasberg, legend of method acting, saw what others couldn't. A young man with a soul full of fractures and a mind full of fire. He belongs here, Strasberg said. And that was the first real validation Dean had ever received as an artist. Training under Strasberg changed everything. Dean learned to use his memories, his grief, his fear of loss, his unresolved anger toward his father, and even the ghost of his mother as fuel. He didn't act, he reopened wounds. He didn't pretend, he relived. Watching him in a scene was like watching someone stand too close to the edge of a cliff, mesmerizing, dangerous, impossible to look away from. New York sharpened him. It also softened him. He found friends, mentors, and a sense of belonging he had never found anywhere else. For a brief moment, he wasn't lost. He wasn't the boy abandoned, the son misunderstood, the young man rejected by Hollywood. He was simply an artist becoming himself. But success always brings a shadow, and for Dean, the shadow was this. Sooner or later, Hollywood was going to come calling again, and he would have to return to the place that once rejected him, but this time he would return as a force that couldn't be ignored. When James Dean returned to Hollywood, he was no longer the awkward outsider studios didn't know what to do with. New York had carved him into something sharper, more dangerous, and infinitely more magnetic. He still didn't fit their rules. He never would. But now his intensity wasn't a problem. It was a weapon. Producers didn't just see a young actor. They saw a spark they couldn't manufacture, a depth they couldn't teach, a rawness that made every other rising star look rehearsed. That was the version of James Dean who walked into the audition room for East of Eden. And for the first time in his life, Hollywood finally saw what only a handful of people had noticed before. He wasn't playing at emotion. He was feeling it. When Elia Kazan cast him as Cal Trask, it wasn't a decision. It was recognition. Cal was a young man aching for the approval of a father who never gave it, an emotional wound Dean understood intimately. In the scenes where Cal reaches for affection and gets rejection instead, Dean wasn't acting. He was reliving quiet, painful memories of his own fractured relationship with his father. Crew members whispered that something about him felt too real, as if the emotions on camera weren't part of the script, but part of a life he still hadn't made peace with. And when audiences later watched the film, they felt an unfamiliar shock. Cal wasn't a character. He was a confession. But the world didn't truly meet James Dean until Rebel Without a Cause. If East of Eden revealed his pain, Rebel revealed the fire he had spent years trying to control. The red jacket, the slouched posture, the simmering frustration, none of it was costume. It was instinct. It was truth. Dean didn't portray a lost young man. He embodied the confusion of an entire generation that felt misunderstood by their families, trapped in expectations they never agreed to, and desperate for connection in a world that felt cold. He became the voice of the restless, the symbol of the silent scream teenagers didn't have the language for. And that famous tear rolling down his cheek as he whispers, "You're tearing me apart," wasn't planned. The emotion broke through, unstoppable, undeniable. Then came Giant, the film that would demand a different version of him. Calmer, older, more introspective. On the surface, it was his least rebellious role, but beneath that quiet exterior was a deeper melancholy that seemed to predict something he never spoke aloud. On set, he was unpredictable. Some days playful, others solemn, withdrawn, distant, as if he sensed time slipping faster than it should. Co-star Elizabeth Taylor saw something in him others didn't, a profound sadness tucked behind the intensity, a vulnerability he tried and failed to hide. She once said he had eyes that looked like they were remembering something painful even when he smiled. The camera agreed. In Giant, Dean aged decades across a single narrative, and audiences didn't just see him grow older, they saw him grow tired. His scenes as Jet Rink, the lonely dreamer chasing something bigger than himself only to find emptiness, felt like a mirror reflecting Dean's deepest fears. That role, completed just days before his death, became an eerie premonition, a final performance vibrating with a tension that made people uneasy without knowing why. 3 films. Only 3. Yet each one was a window into a different fragment of his soul. The wounded child, the rebellious youth, the longing adult. Hollywood had never witnessed anything like him because he wasn't simply performing. He was unraveling. And with every unraveling, he drew people closer, making them feel as if they were watching not a character, but a human being standing on the edge of something beautiful and dangerous, moments before the fall. Long before Hollywood crowned him the face of youthful rebellion, James Dean discovered a kind of tenderness he never thought he would feel again, something fragile, warm, and unexpectedly safe. Her name was Pier Angeli. She was everything he wasn't, refined where he was raw, disciplined where he was impulsive, serene where he was storm. She had the soft, luminous presence of someone raised in a world full of rules and expectations, while Dean carried the restless energy of a boy who had spent his entire life running from ghosts he could never outpace. And yet, when they were together, the noise inside him quieted in a way even racing, acting, or fame could not replicate. Their love began quietly, almost shyly. They met on the Warner Bros. Lot, sharing small moments between takes, conversations, glances, unspoken truths. Pier later said that Dean had the saddest smile in the world, the kind that made her want to protect him, to hold the fragile parts he tried so hard to hide. For Dean, she was a refuge, a gentle reminder that life could still offer softness. She saw past the leather jacket, the cigarettes, the brooding gaze. She saw the lonely boy who had lost his mother and never fully recovered. But love, in their case, wasn't enough. Pier came from a strict Catholic Italian family, and her mother believed Dean was entirely wrong for her daughter. He was too rebellious, too unpredictable, too American, too secular, too everything they feared. Dean tried to be respectful, even polite, but it didn't matter. Every time he visited the Angeli household, he felt the cold wall of disapproval pressing against him. He wasn't welcome, he wasn't suitable, he wasn't the future they wanted for Pier. Behind the scenes, studio politics made everything worse. MGM didn't want their rising Italian star tied to a troublemaker from another studio, and whispers circulated that Pier's career would suffer if she stayed involved with him. Pressure mounted. Doors closed. The quiet romance that had once felt like an escape slowly turned into a battlefield neither of them could win. The breaking point came abruptly. While Dean was away filming, Pier's family arranged her engagement to singer Vic Damone. Dean returned to find her no longer his, no longer free to choose the life she truly wanted. And yet, the most heartbreaking moment came on her wedding day. Dressed in his worn jacket and leaning against his motorcycle, Dean stood across the street from the church, watching the woman he loved walk down the aisle with someone else. He didn't try to stop the ceremony. He didn't shout her name. He simply watched, eyes hollow, cigarette shaking between his fingers as the final thread connecting them snapped. Friends said he was never the same after that. Something inside him dimmed. Quietly, painfully, permanently. He buried himself in work, in racing, in distractions that only intensified the loneliness he tried to outrun. Yet he never spoke badly of Pier, never pretended she didn't matter. She became one more ghost in a life already full of them. Years later, Pier confessed in an interview that Dean had been the love of my life, words that arrived too late for both of them. She admitted she had wanted to run away with him, to choose passion over obligation, but fear, hers and her family's, had won. The tragedy of their love wasn't that it ended, but that it ended not because of who they were, but because of who the world demanded they become. James Dean carried many wounds, but the one with Pier Angeli never healed. It simply became another shadow following him into the darkness. Racing was never just a hobby for James Dean. It was a craving, a compulsion, a way to silence the storm inside him. When he was behind the wheel, the world that usually pressed on his shoulders seemed to fall away. The hum of the engine became a heartbeat louder than regret, louder than fear, louder even than the ghosts he carried. On a racetrack, he wasn't the boy who lost his mother, or the man who watched the love of his life slip through his fingers. He wasn't the actor burdened by expectations. He was free, recklessly, dangerously free. His obsession deepened in 1955 when he bought the car that would make him immortal, a Porsche 550 Spider, silver and wickedly beautiful. He christened it Little Bastard, a name that felt both playful and prophetic. The car was light, fast, and ferocious, built not for casual driving, but for men willing to flirt with death for speed. Dean didn't just flirt, he pursued. He saw in that machine the same wildness he felt in himself, an intensity that demanded control but refused to be tamed. Friends worried. Colleagues warned him. Even strangers sensed the danger. But Dean only smiled, brushing concerns aside with a shrug or a joke, as if the risks that terrified others were nothing more than background noise to him. In truth, the danger was the appeal. Racing gave him the closest thing to peace he would ever find. It was the one place where he could push himself to the edge without having to explain why he needed to be there. During the filming of Giant, Warner Bros. Recognized the risk and banned him from racing until production wrapped. Dean agreed reluctantly, knowing that the set wasn't the place to challenge fate. But the moment the cameras stopped rolling, he returned to the world he loved. The ban lifted, the engine roared again, and he felt the familiar rush that always made his pulse quicken, not from fear, but from exhilaration. September 30th, 1955 began like any other day. Dean planned to drive to Salinas to participate in a sports car race. His mechanic and friend, Rolf Weatherich, rode beside him. They joked, they talked about the car's handling, they planned their evening. Witnesses later said Dean had an unusual calmness about him that day, a serenity that felt almost out of character. It wasn't joy, but something quieter, acceptance, maybe, or simply the comfort of doing something he loved. As they sped toward their destination, other drivers waved at the little silver Porsche, charmed by the sight of a movie star behind the wheel of such a machine. Dean waved back, relaxed, unaware that every mile was carrying him closer to the moment that would freeze him in time. At 5:45 p.m., at a lonely intersection near Chilame, California, a 1950 Ford Tudor driven by Donald Turnipseed turned across Dean's lane. Whither it shattered. Dean reacted instantly, swerving, braking, fighting for control. But physics won. The impact was brutal, twisting metal, crushing frames, and hurling the little car off the pavement in a tangled scream of steel and dust. When the dust settled, James Dean was dying. Paramedics arrived quickly, but it didn't matter. At 24 years old, the restless soul who had lived too intensely for the world around him slipped away before reaching the hospital. The news spread like wildfire. Shock, disbelief, a collective gasp from a world that had just begun to understand what they had in him. In the aftermath, Little Bastard was declared cursed. Pieces of the wreck would injure, maim, and even kill others in the years that followed. But the real tragedy was simpler, quieter. Hollywood had lost the one actor who didn't just play emotions, he lived them, bled them, left them raw on the screen. James Dean didn't fear death. He feared wasting his life. And in the end, he lived so intensely that the world still feels the echo of his impact, long after the engine of Little Bastard went silent. James Dean left the world in the same way he lived in it, fast, bright, and impossible to ignore. 3 films were all he needed to shift the culture, to reshape the meaning of youth, and to etch himself into the mythology of Hollywood forever. Most actors chase entire lifetimes trying to create a legacy. Dean created one almost accidentally, as if his very existence was destined to be brief but unforgettable, like a flare burning white-hot before collapsing into darkness. What makes him eternal isn't simply that he died young. Countless stars have burned out early, but none carried the strange electricity Dean did. He was a paradox, rebellious yet shy, magnetic yet fractured, bold yet deeply wounded. That vulnerability, hidden beneath leather jackets and cigarettes, made him real in a way audiences weren't used to. He didn't hide his pain, he transformed it. Every role he played felt like a glimpse into the chambers of a heart trying desperately to heal, a heart that had experienced too much loss too early and never found a safe place to rest. Long after his death, actors who idolized him, Pacino, DiCaprio, Sheen, studied not his technique, but his courage. He dared to be messy, raw, unpredictable. He dared to feel on camera in a way that seemed almost too intimate for film. That honesty became his signature and eventually his legend. Today, James Dean remains suspended in time. He never aged, never faded, never compromised. He belongs to no era and every era at once. When we look at his photos, we don't just see a young man. We see possibility, fragility, fury, beauty. We see a life that wasn't long, but full. So full, it could only exist for a moment. He lived quickly. He died suddenly. And somehow, in that narrow space between the two, he became immortal.